Hi, it's Elise, and I am already proving what it is that I was intending to talk about around collaborative reclamation. I was going to begin each session by highlighting what the point of this is. We're going to do it together. I'm not just going to deliver information to you. And it's going to be a laboratory. It's going to get messy. We're not going to know what's going to happen. It's going to take us in directions that we weren't anticipating. And that is already true. So as I started preparing for this event, I had this sense that there was some core information I needed to provide at the beginning of every session. And then I needed to create the real collaborative experience, but that there had to be this underlying foundational material that everyone had to make sense of where we were going to go. And I thought, if I broke it up into 3 sessions, then we would be saving a lot of time. And then I realized, wow, if I have to do this introduction 3 times, then we're losing time. So what else is possible? And what else is possible is that I share this information with you in advance. I provide you with these slides and with this run through the slides, and then we're able to use our time even more effectively together. So that's what I'm going to do. So let's go through them very quickly. First slide is the introduction slide. Slide number 2 is about the session orientation. I'm going to still talk about that in our live event, so let's move on. 3 levels of reclamation. I'm going to talk about that a lot more in our live event, and I think a little bit at the end of this recording. The most important one for us to start with is the idea of recognition. We're going to enhance your sense of trust that you actually know what you know, because the whole point of collaborative reclamation is to provide you with the optimally supportive environment for you to know what you know and to put it into practical use in your life. So I'm going to be in this little slideshow presentation asking you some questions, and you would be well served to put the recording on pause and take notes for yourself so that you apply this to your life, so that you see how it's relevant uniquely to you, so that you get a sense of why this might be useful in particular areas of your life where things are not going the way that you'd like them to go. If you just listen, you're going to miss that. So please do the interactive part. You're not going to have the value of the group coherence that we're going to only have in our live events, but you do want to be able to use the power of recognition. So pause when I ask you a question and let yourself come up with the answer. All right, now we're moving on to slide number 4, which is that I'm really talking to you and stepping you into an entirely new paradigm. And it is a big deal. And there's a lot to cover. It's like a whole world, basically, or actually it's 5 different worlds that all are interlocking and make something cohesively new, which is why we are doing it this way, because we really want to maximize the time we can spend in our session doing collaborative, active process work. So the inspiration had come to me to break this into 3 different sessions, so it wasn't like a really long, single, half-day virtual event. But then I realized doing this introduction 3 times was not going to be optimal. So we're going to be very fluid, and we're going to be allowing something new and better to emerge every step of the process, and that's what we're doing here. So if you can only attend 1 or 2 of the sessions, then you're going to have the coherent explanation, and then we're going to dive deep into some of the material, some piece of the material. So if you want the whole picture, send me an email with the word yes in it, and I will send you the recordings, all 3 of them, minus the personal group sessions, so that you can have the whole picture. Okay? So where are we going to begin? We're going to begin with recognition. Like I said, I want to remind you that you actually already know. So get out a piece of paper and a pen and be prepared. The first question I'm going to ask you is, when you look in a baby's eyes, so remember the last time you looked at a baby, and if you don't have a great sense of that, then look in this baby's eyes and just tune in on the level of the heart, not on the level of your preconceived knowledge, but tune in on the level of the heart to this beautiful image that we're looking at. What do you see when you look in this baby's face? I want you to pause this recording and write down what you see, what comes up for you, what you notice, what you recognize. Okay, if we were doing this live, I would have taken time to have you put your answers in the chat, and then I would have found the common themes. So we have to kind of collapse time here, and I'm going to tell you that what most people see when they look at a baby is that a baby has this vibrant aliveness behind its eyes. It's an animated spark of aliveness, of real presence, and it's always there when you look at a baby. And then maybe when you look at a 7-year-old, it's dimmer. And when you look at a teenager, it's dimmer. And when you look at a 40-year-old, it's much dimmer. So babies have this in abundance, and that's one of the reasons you kind of feel good and nurtured and catalyzed when you spend time with a baby. So there's vibrancy and a sense of being whole and complete. And by that I mean a sense of fullness, a sense of that vibrancy sends out a sense of, I have everything I need. I feel connected to everything I need. I don't feel separate from it yet. There's also a sense of uniqueness. You look in a baby's eyes and you see they already have something completely unique in them. Looking in that baby's eyes is completely different than looking in any other baby's eyes. It's already there, okay? It's not, they don't grow into it. Our uniqueness, our essential spark is with us right from the beginning. Babies also are living in the moment. They're full of presence in the moment. They're authentically expressing. They're not withholding. They're not holding back. They're giving all of themselves to the present moment. And they don't have any preconceived notions or agendas of how they want things to be. They're just kind of curious and open and willing to see what happens next. They're in wonder. They're in awe. And those are such delightful, delicious qualities. I'm going to ask you, how many of these qualities that I just described have you retained? Have you retained your vibrancy, your animated aliveness? Are you filling every moment and every connection with another person with that radiance that is uniquely you? Have you retained your sense of uniqueness? Do you totally love, adore, and appreciate the unique expression that gets to come through you? Are you confident about it? Are you happy to share it with people? Do you feel complete and resourced and supported at every moment? Do you feel whole and one? I forgot to mention interconnectedness is another quality of the baby. The baby doesn't even know that it's separate from its mother. So it knows it's part of all that is. It doesn't feel a sense of separation. Have you retained that ability to find yourself connected to all that is and to know that that's the truth about you? Have you been able to retain your full presence? And have you retained your ability to be authentically in the moment without any preconceived notions or agendas? It's going to be very unusual for someone to say that they've retained all of those. So my next question to you is, to what degree do you have a desire to restore and reclaim those? Because that's what this is all about. If that doesn't sound exciting or intriguing to you, then you can close up this recording right now. But if it does sound exciting and inspiring to you, then I've got really, really good news for you. And that's the first essential premise of our work here today, is to turn to slide number 6. I want to tell you that all of that I've just described is still present inside of you. That animation, that wholeness, that resourced and complete, inclusively interconnected, self-regarding and honoring our uniqueness, self-authoring in the moment, sovereign in the moment. All of that is still present inside of you. It's just been covered up with layers and layers of coping and defense mechanisms and roles and identities and masks and validation seeking and the need to belong and fit in has created a distorted cover that's hiding all of this from yourself. And what our purpose is as we get together is going to be to reclaim this. These qualities of you still are present whenever you find yourself in what I'm going to refer to as the higher octave. Some of you call it heaven on earth. Some of you call it 5D. Some of you call it unity consciousness. I'm going to just call it the higher octave. We just need to have a higher octave and a lower octave, and you know the difference between the two. You know when you are in that open, available present state, and when you're in the lower octave, more characterized by fear and shame and blame and regret and guilt, and I can go on. When you're experiencing stress, struggle, sacrificing, selling out, those are all the lower octave. And it's not surprising that we spend so much time in the lower octave. We've actually been indoctrinated, enculturated into the lower octave. In fact, the most honest thing I can say to you is if you turn to slide number 7, it's spells that have trapped us in the lower octave, like the spell demonstrated on slide number 7, the drama triangle of Dr. Stephen Cartman, the looping between I feel like a victim, so I experience that person or that situation like a persecutor, and I'm desperate for a rescuer. That spell, victim, persecutor, rescuer, keeps us trapped in the lower octave. And in order for you to get the most out of this recording, I want you to take your piece of paper and your pen, and I want you to ask yourself about some areas of your life where you feel like you spend some time in the lower octave. I'm going to give you a couple just to prompt you. Very likely politics puts us in the lower octave. Some of our more difficult relationships, family and intimate, put us in the lower octave. For very many of us, topics like money and health and career and self-esteem and physical attractiveness and acquisitions all put us in the lower octave. We're now on slide 8, where I'm going into details about the spells that have trapped you in the lower octave. And I'm going to be giving you information about 5 foundational fears that underlie these 5 spells. So I want you to be thinking about some of the areas that you recognize are places where you spin in the lower octave. And I want you to just think of 1 or 2 or 3 of those and write them down. Maybe politics, maybe relationships, or money. Just write them down, because as I go over these, I want you to see if you recognize any of these fears and their related spells operating in that area of your life that's holding you in the lower octave. So the first foundational fear is, I'm not enough. Broadens out to, I'm unworthy, I'm insignificant, I don't matter, I'm not valuable. And that together is the spell of inferiority. And when we're under the spell of inferiority, we typically use self-diminishment, we self-abandon, and we shield and soothe and do other self-sabotaging things. So I'm not enough creates the spell of inferiority. And is any I'm not enough present in your relationships? Is any I'm not enough present in your perspective on your career? Is any I'm not enough present in your self-esteem, the way you feel about yourself physically? The second is there's not enough, and that creates the spell of scarcity and stress. Now, this is all about our nervous system overwhelm, from the perception that life's demands are greater than our resources. So my definition of stress, okay, and you can feel into this, stress is when the experience of life's demands feels greater than the resources that we think we have to meet those demands. So what most people do is to reduce their stress, they want to reduce the demands on themselves because they don't feel like they have enough resources. There's not enough. I'm not resourced. So that creates the experience that I mentioned earlier of stress and struggle, striving, sacrificing, selling out. Those are all parts of there's not enough. Do you notice any there's not enough in your experience of money, or in your experience of career, or in your experience of acquiring the stuff that you want to have that will make you happy? That's the second of the 5 foundational fears. The third of the 5 foundational fears is I'm afraid to be alone. That broadens out to I feel unlovable, I feel like I don't belong, I feel like I'm bound to be rejected or abandoned, and that leads to the spell of separation. And how we experience the spell of separation is we're often hypervigilant, we cut ourselves off, or we're withholding. We don't feel a sense of alliance. We don't feel a sense of interconnectedness. So do you notice any of that spell in your relationships? Do you notice any of that spell in your experience of family and also intimacy? That's kind of a key underlying one of how we interact with the tribe. The 4th spell is I fear that I'm fundamentally flawed. I fear that I'm inadequate or defective, bad, broken, can't be fixed. And that leads to the spell of fragmentation, which we're going to go on to in much more detail in the True Essence Incubator session. But this is a time when you are fragmented, we are experiencing kind of a sense of self-abandonment. We're disconnected from ourselves. We're in pieces. Do you notice that showing up in any of your relationships? Do you notice that showing up related to your health or your career or your self-esteem? And finally, we already looked at this a little bit. I'm helpless and at the effect of life is the fear. Broaden that out to insecure, unable to control my destiny, powerless, unsupported, unsafe. That creates the spell of victimization, which is a lack of trust in ourselves, others, and life itself. And it connects directly to that drama triangle of victim, persecutor, and rescuer. And helpless is very likely underneath your feeling about politics, very likely underneath your feeling about money and health. So I'm going to really be curious, and I would love to hear if any of you found a place in your life where you have a sense of being in the lower octave, a sense of being at the effect of life, but you don't make a connection to any of those 5 foundational fears or 5 spells. If you find one, please, please, please send me an email. I'd like to know. That would be a fascinating thing for me. So, now that we've seen these spells, the point is not to just lament that we're in these spells. We are not staying in the lower octave, clearly. Let's move to our slide number 9. And I'm going to go quickly through this as well. I will be going into it in far more detail in the 3rd True Essence Incubator. That's why I made that session a little bit longer, because there is critical information to share in that one. But I want you to think about those areas that you found yourself spinning in the lower octave, and I want you to go into recognition. I want you to feel into the truth of how those experiences in your relationships, politics, finances, health, career, self-esteem, money, how they're being held in place by the mechanism I'm going to describe here. Think about how you might not have been able to make significant changes in any of these areas, despite how much you desire a change, despite how much information you acquire about better ways to handle this area, and despite how much you may have tried through effort and willpower. The reason you can't make a change in those areas through desire or thinking or efforting is because you're trapped in a spell. Now, spells mean that we've locked ourselves, because we've done it to ourselves, not deliberately, but in an actually intelligent, adaptive way that made a lot of sense at one point in our lives and just doesn't make sense now. We've locked ourselves into a contraction of biological, psychological, and emotional survival mechanisms. And the way to remember this is the device that I'm providing you with right here. S of spells means you experienced a shattering situation, typically very early in your life. A shattering situation has the following characteristics. You experienced overwhelm, you experienced powerlessness, inescapability, and a sense of being isolated or alone. There's actually neuroscientific evidence that I'm going to provide in the third session about how this shattering takes place. But I'm providing this information to you in conjunction with scientifically validated information about how your brain works. So there's a shattering situation that has all of those qualities that affects you on a physiological basis. That's the P. So you end up with fundamental nervous system dysregulation due to the arousal of the amygdala and the limbic system. So that's how this spell not only affects you emotionally and mentally, but it affects you physically. It activates and it gets held in your body, encoded in your body. So that's the P. The E is about emotions, and emotions are the linchpin holding the spell in place. Acute, fragmented emotions become enmeshed and encoded with memory, and in our third session, I'll be explaining this in detail, how the neuroscience works. If you can't be on that session, send me an email with the word yes, and I'll send you the recording after the presentation. But E is for emotions, L is for limitation. So as I said, initially, when we locked ourselves into this spell, it was an adaptive response to the overwhelm, powerlessness, inescapability, and isolation of the moment. It was initially adaptive, and then it became maladaptive as it outlived its usefulness. So limitations we accepted, and then we got trapped in them. And the final L of spell is the loss of connection to self, to others, and life. So when you're under a spell, I want you to recognize this and think about these particular areas that you were focused on. No matter how much you desire a change, your emotions are locking you in place. No matter how much you know in your head, your ways of thinking and strategizing are not enough to overcome the limits of the spell, of the maladaptive perspectives. And no matter how much you've tried through effort and willpower, your actions have not been enough to break you free. If I had more time and we were actually together, I'd break you up into groups to discuss this, and it would be quite awesome and revelatory. But the big question you're obviously going to have now is, how do we shatter the spells? So going on to our next slide, slide number 10. This is the part of the event where I get to reveal what I really needed to do for the past decade to get underneath the hood so I can actually provide the step-by-step processes to provide true reclamation. The acronym that I just provided to you about spells is actually a direct explanation from current leading-edge neuroscience on the subject of trauma. And Bessel van der Kolk, who is a Dutch psychiatrist, has been studying trauma since the 1970s. His conviction is that we impact trauma the most by providing new experiences that directly contradict what the body and brain has learned from trauma. So this idea of directly contradicting, of unhooking you from the experience that you had locked in place with the spell, then unlocking your body, unlocking your emotions, unlocking your mind, giving you a new experience of this subject, and then unleashing, once again, your natural wholeness, your natural presence, your natural animation, is really all about how we're going to do this reclamation. We're going to embody a new story through this providing of contradictory information. And embodying a new story is actually what reclamation is all about. So let's go on to slide 11. We're going to break these spells by providing directly contradictory experience of 5 evolutionary forces that operate exclusively in the higher octave. So I just shared with you spells and fears that exist in the lower octave. We're going to contradict those 5 spells and fears by evolutionary forces that exist in the higher octave. And they are directly correlated, okay? So the inherent dignity force is what heals the spell of inferiority, I'm not enough, and allows us to reclaim self-regard. The fullness of home force heals the spell of scarcity and stress and reclaims resourced and complete. The collaborative we force, we is how Daniel Siegel, who is a brilliant interpersonal neurobiology, he's the person who created the entire field of interpersonal neurobiology. He talks about when you put me and we together in a synthesis, you experience we. And I love that. So the collaborative we force heals the spell of separation, I'm afraid of being alone, and helps us reclaim inclusive interconnectivity. The holding, purifying force heals the spell of fragmentation, I'm broken and fundamentally flawed, and reclaims remembered wholeness. And finally, synchronization with the self-organizing intelligence heals the spell of victimization and reclaims self-authoring sovereignty. Now, I'm sure that you've made the connection right now between a lot of these slides that I'm showing you. You can see the connection between these 5 evolutionary forces and the slide that I showed you earlier. You can just go back to it. It is slide number 8 that has the 5 foundational fears. But you're also going to notice that if you go back to slide number 6, I've just described the 5 qualities that we recognize are present in the baby that we want to reclaim. And they are an exact match to what I just shared with you about these 5 evolutionary forces and the gifts of these 5 evolutionary forces. So going on to slide 12, pulling it all together. Reclamation is the conscious leap from the lower to the higher octave. So in the lower octave, the spell of victimization shows up as this triangle, but in the higher octave, instead of being a chooser, instead of being a victim, you recognize yourself as a chooser. You don't see a person or a situation as a persecutor anymore. You recognize that they're catalyzing growth and evolution in you. And you're not looking for rescuers, you're looking for collaborators to hold hands with you and to support you as you reclaim your power. So you're moving out of the spell of victimization into the power, the reclaimed power of self-authoring sovereignty, the ability to be authentic in the moment without any preconceived notions or agendas and authentically express yourself. So that's what reclamation is. If we jump to slide 13, you'll see that reclamation takes place when we consciously align with these evolutionary forces by choosing to re-know everything we have assumed that we know about life, about one another, and about ourselves. And slide 14, I broke them down. The first session we're doing is to reclaim what we know about life. I'm going to be giving you experiences of that in our Coming Home to Ourselves session. Our second session is reclaiming what we know about one another. And we're going to be doing exercises around that in our collaborative emergence session. And finally, reclaiming what we know about ourselves is the final session, the longer one, where we go into more details about the spells and the trauma and how to break them. And that will be our True Essence Incubator sessions. So, as I said, if you go from this slide 14 back to 11, back to 8, back to 6, you'll see the thread running through all of it. So thank you for listening. Thank you for walking through this with me. I really believe that this was very useful. It will save us a lot of time. I'm not going to have to tell this story at the beginning of every session. And I'm just delighted to be on this journey with you because this is even more real and alive and hopeful than I ever dreamed it would be. And I can't wait to share it with you and see you on Sunday. Bye-bye. Hi, it's Elise.